Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this really comforting expectation of precision.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, it feels like engineering or something. Like you break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line, and the doctor just points a pen at the screen and says, there it is, that's the problem.
Right. It's completely binary. Like it's broken or it's not broken.
Yeah.
And we deeply crave that kind of visibility when it comes to pain.
We really do.
We want to be able to just categorize it, point to the source, and, put a physical cast on it.
But then you step into the world of neurodevelopment, you step into the world of trauma, and suddenly that x-ray machine it's completely useless.
Yeah, the visibility is gone.
Exactly. We end up looking at a diagnostic landscape that is incredibly murky. Because, how do you take an x-ray of an internal psychological bleed?
You can't.
Right. How do you put a cast on the invisible, agonizing pain of social rejection?
Yeah, it's a completely different paradigm.
It is. And welcome to Today in the Hypothesis. If you're joining us right now, whether you're commuting or, folding laundry or just taking a walk, it means you have that specific kind of curiosity. You want to understand the hidden mechanisms of human behavior. You want to know why you react the way you do, why your partner or your friends react the way they do, and you want to actually understand the mechanics of it, without drowning in academic jargon. So I am incredibly glad you're here.
It's a complex landscape we're walking into today, but I'd argue it's one of the most vital things we can possibly explore.
Oh, for sure.
Because humans are fundamentally biologically social creatures. I mean, the fear of being pushed out of the group isn't just some, fleeting anxiety. It is quite literally woven into our DNA.
And today we've got this massive stack of sources on the table to help us navigate how that fear actually operates.
Really comprehensive stack, yeah.
Yeah. The centerpiece of our material is this major research synthesis. It's titled Evolutionary and Psychobiological Determinants of Gendered Rejection Sensitivity by Victor H. Sertouche.
Right.
But we aren't stopping at just one paper. We're pulling from this massive web of clinical studies, neurobiological research, socioeconomic models, and even historical and religious texts.
It really covers a lot of ground.
It does. And our mission today, the core question we're going to just obsess over for this whole session is this. Why do men and women process, manifest, and basically mitigate the psychological pain of social rejection so completely differently?
And to answer that, we have to look at the central thesis presented across all these sources.
Okay, let's hear it.
The hypothesis is that an unstable upbringing creates a profound gender divergence in how we handle rejection. Specifically, the research suggests women are predisposed toward what they call an expressive liability to rejection.
Expressive liability, got it.
Right. While men are driven toward emotional concealment and retreat. And, I really want to set the tone for our listeners right now. We are going to examine this completely impartially.
Yes, that is so important.
We're looking through the lenses of biology, history, and economics to find the why behind the what. We aren't here to, assign blame or validate cultural stereotypes. We're literally just here to understand the raw mechanics of human survival.
The why behind the what. I think that's crucial because it's so easy to look around and just say, well, society just tells boys not to cry and tells girls to be emotional.
Right, which it does.
Society absolutely does do that, and we're going to get into the cultural software later on. But if you want to understand how your mind reacts to modern rejection, like, say, getting ghosted on a dating app, or being passed over for a promotion, or just feeling left out of a group chat, we have to look at how our ancestors survived it. The roots go millions of years deeper than modern culture.
They absolutely do.
So I want to start with this foundational biological concept that the sources bring up, life history theory.
Yeah, life history theory, or LHT. This is the evolutionary framework that this entire divergence is basically built upon.
Okay, break it down for us.
At its core, LHT looks at how an organism allocates its bioenergetic resources.
Bioenergetic resources.
Right. Think of it as your biological time and energy. You only have so much of it, right?
Right. There's a limit.
Exactly. As a human, your body has to unconsciously decide how to spend that energy based on the environmental cues you encounter, especially during those really critical developmental windows in early childhood.
I'm trying to picture what that actually means in practice. We're talking about literal calories and cellular energy here, right?
Yes, literal physiological energy.
Does the body spend energy growing taller or building a stronger immune system or preparing to reproduce?
Precisely. And the body makes those allocation decisions based on how safe the environment feels.
Okay, let's bring in an analogy here because thinking about this like a financial budget during a crisis really helped me grasp the mechanics.
It's a great way to look at it.
Yeah. Imagine you're running a startup company. If the market is stable, you have reliable investors, everything's predictable, you invest your capital in like a 10-year research and development plan,
Mm-hmm.
you take your time, you build a solid foundation.
And in biology, we call that a slow life history strategy.
Slow life history.
Right. You delay reproduction, you invest heavily in your own physical and mental development, and when you do have offspring, you invest massive amounts of time and energy into keeping them alive.
Okay, but if that startup thinks it might go bankrupt next month, like the market is chaotic, investors are pulling out, it's just totally unpredictable, you do not invest in a 10-year plan.
No, you can't afford to.
Right. You burn through your venture capital fast, you optimize for immediate risky gains just to keep the doors open today.
And that is the fast life history strategy.
Oh.
When a child grows up in an environment characterized by harshness and unpredictability, maybe resources are scarce, or, parental care is highly inconsistent, or there's violence, that environment acts as a distal risk factor.
A distal risk. Yeah.
It sends a chemical signal to the developing brain and body that basically says, the world is dangerous. You might not live very long. You need to accelerate your biological timeline.
Wow. What does that acceleration literally look like in a human being, though?
Well, it optimizes for immediate reproduction over long-term survival.
Okay.
Physically, we see earlier maturation. For example, girls in highly stressful, unpredictable environments often experience earlier menarche, their first period.
Right.
Behaviorally, it can manifest as impulsivity, a higher number of sexual partners throughout life, and generally lower investment in individual offspring.
Wow.
The biological strategy is essentially prioritizing quantity over quality in a world where, honestly, survival feels like a coin toss.
But here is where the analogy gets really specific to our core question.
Mm-hmm.
The way a female startup versus a male startup spends that accelerated energy is like entirely dictated by the biological cost of their respective products.
Yes, this is the asymmetry in ancestral reproductive investment.
Right. Break that down.
So for women, the physical and temporal demands of reproduction were, and fundamentally still are, astronomically high.
Yeah, obviously.
We're talking about 9 months of energy-intensive gestation, the massive physical risk of childbirth, especially without modern medicine.
Oh, yeah, huge risk.
And then years of nursing and child rearing where the mother is physically tethered to the infant, requiring massive caloric intake and leaving her highly vulnerable to predators.
It's a massive biological investment, and for men, the biological investment is incredibly low. I mean, from a purely physiological standpoint, it's just sperm production.
Exactly.
It takes very little time and very few calories.
So let's take that asymmetry and apply it to the concept of social rejection in an ancestral, like hunter-gatherer environment.
Okay.
For a woman, the evolutionary cost of social rejection was fundamentally deadlier.
Deadlier.
Yeah. If a female was excluded from her social group or abandoned by a partner, she faced a dramatically lower chance of her offspring surviving.
Right, because she's on her own.
She couldn't hunt large game, protect against predators, and forage enough calories for two while nursing an infant.
So to be rejected by the tribe basically meant death. Not just for her, but for her genetic line. It was an existential threat.
Consequently, women evolved a hypervigilance to social cues.
Oh, hypervigilance.
To survive, they had to constantly monitor the emotional temperature of the group, to ensure they weren't on the verge of being cast out.
That sounds exhausting.
It is. And this led to an adaptive stress response that researchers call tend-and-befriend.
Tend-and-befriend.
Yeah. When faced with stress or the threat of rejection, the ancestral female strategy was to seek affiliation. They needed to repair social bonds through expressive emotionality, to signal distress, and to basically pull the community closer to ensure physical protection.
Okay, let's unpack this. Tend and befriend. It's like, I am stressed, therefore I must connect to survive.
Exactly.
But the male adaptive response went in a completely different direction because his biological costs were different.
Right. In those same unstable environments, a male's survival and reproductive success didn't depend on keeping the social group perfectly harmonious.
What did it depend on?
It depended on his ability to acquire resources, take risks, and most importantly, maintain status within male-dominated hierarchies.
And you don't maintain status in a brutal ancestral male hierarchy by crying, showing fear, and asking for a hug.
No,
Mhm.
absolutely not.
Yeah.
Showing vulnerability or excessive emotional neediness would signal weakness. It would invite challengers to take your resources, your territory, or your position in the hierarchy. So the male adaptive response became fight or flight, or in many cases of social threat, freeze.
Freeze.
Yeah, they had to suppress vulnerability. Their fast life strategy increased their mating effort and competition, which essentially required emotional detachment. They became self-reliant and avoidant when stressed.
That is endlessly fascinating to me. Like the exact same unstable environment, say a famine or a constant physical threat from a neighboring tribe, produces a fast life strategy in both genders.
Mm-hmm.
But the behavioral output is totally flipped. The women prioritize social stability, become hypervigilant to rejection, and visibly seek affiliation.
Right.
And the men prioritize resource status, suppress the pain of rejection, and seek distance or dominance.
And this evolutionary variable is what the paper identifies as the foundation of the expressive liability in women.
Okay, so that's where that term comes from.
Right, meaning their emotional responses to threat are front-loaded and highly visible versus the retreat in men. They're both trying to survive the same chaotic world. They're just utilizing the different physiological tools their biology provided.
Now, if you're listening to this, you might be thinking, okay, evolution is a great story.
Sure.
It paints this incredibly vivid picture of our ancestors huddled around a fire, constantly assessing their social standing. But I'm not huddled around a fire, dodging saber-toothed tigers. I'm sitting in an office or a coffee shop.
Exactly.
So I really want to transition from the theoretical to the physical. Like, how do these million-year-old survival strategies actually manifest in our bloodstreams today? Because the sources dive straight into the modern neurobiology of this, and the mechanics of it, I mean, it completely changed my perspective.
The neurobiological research is where we really see a major paradigm shift in the scientific community.
How so?
Well, for a long time, science viewed stress mechanisms as merely sectomorphic.
Sex-dimorphic.
Right. That meant we assumed men and women use the exact same biological pathways to process stress, just to different degrees, a difference in volume, essentially.
Oh.
But the current sources show we actually need to view them as sex-specific or sex dichotomous.
Meaning they're literally using non-overlapping pathways.
Exactly.
It's not just a difference in volume on the same radio, they're broadcasting on entirely different frequencies.
Let's look at what researchers call the cortisol divide to understand how different these frequencies are.
Okay, let's do it.
So cortisol is our primary stress hormone. It's the body's internal alarm bell. When researchers measure physiological reactivity to social rejection, they find a really stark difference.
What kind of difference?
Women demonstrate significantly greater cortisol surges, specifically in response to social rejection stressors.
Okay, so if a woman feels excluded from a group conversation or experiences a really harsh interpersonal conflict with a friend, her biological alarm bell rings much louder than a man's would in that exact same social situation.
Yes, her biological system is uniquely tuned to the threat of social exclusion, remembering that ancestral cost we just discussed.
Right.
But men react more intensely, with higher cortisol surges, to achievement-based stressors.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, failing a test, losing a job, losing a competition, or facing a threat to their status. Their alarm bell is tuned to resource acquisition and hierarchy.
That perfectly maps onto the life history theory blueprint.
It does.
But I want to pause here because there's a part of the neurochemical research in these sources that really threw me.
Okay.
They talk extensively about oxytocin. Now, wait a minute. The pop science articles I've read for the last decade have always called oxytocin the cuddle hormone or like the love molecule.
Right, the love molecule.
Yeah, you hug your kid, you release oxytocin, you feel bonded and safe. Are the sources saying that is an oversimplification? Because reading through the data, it sounds like this love molecule actually pushes men away under stress.
It is a massive oversimplification,
Oh.
and we really need to correct the public understanding of this.
Please do.
The pop science narrative of oxytocin has done us a huge disservice because it treats the hormone in a vacuum. Oxytocin is not a standalone love switch.
It's not.
No, it operates more like an amplifier, and what it amplifies depends entirely on the other chemicals present in the room, so to speak.
Okay, let's walk through the chemical room for women first. What happens when a woman is stressed?
In females, oxytocin is potentiated or strengthened by the presence of estrogen.
Estrogen. Okay.
When a woman experiences a stressor, her body releases oxytocin alongside estrogen. In this specific chemical environment, oxytocin acts as a cortisol antagonist.
Memeing.
That means it actively fights and lowers the stress hormone.
Oh, wow. So it chemically drives that tend-and-befriend response.
Okay.
The woman's brain is essentially saying, I am stressed, my cortisol is high, but if I go hug my friend or talk to my mom, I will get a hit of oxytocin and estrogen, which will kill this cortisol and make me feel physically safe. It chemically rewards her for seeking social support to mitigate distress.
It's a brilliant survival mechanism. But now, let's look at the male chemical room.
Okay.
In males, there's a comparative lack of estrogen. Instead, the room is filled with testosterone and vasopressin.
Vasopressin.
Right. When a man is stressed, oxytocin is released, but it interacts with those hormones instead. High levels of vasopressin in males actually underpin agonistic or aggressive and territorial behaviors.
Let me make sure I'm grasping this. Are you saying the exact same chemical oxytocin can promote affiliation and hugging in one sex and aggression or distancing in the other?
Yes. The presence of vasopressin fundamentally rewires the hormone's behavioral output.
That is wild.
What's fascinating here is that for a man, a surge of oxytocin in a highly stressful situation might not make him want to cuddle.
Right.
It might make him want to defend his territory, retreat into his cave, or push people away to maintain his emotional distance and perceive safety. The chemical machinery is entirely sex dichotomous.
If you are listening right now, just think about how mind-blowing that is. It completely changes how you view a conflict between a man and a woman.
It really does.
Let's say a couple is having a really stressful argument. She's stressed, so her biology is screaming at her to talk it out, to connect, to seek affiliation so she can lower her cortisol.
Right.
He's stressed, so his biology is mixing oxytocin with vasopressin, screaming at him to pull away, to get defensive, to protect his status.
Exactly.
They're both just trying to survive the stress, but their chemical manuals are written in completely different languages. One is seeking proximity to feel safe. The other is seeking distance to feel safe.
And we see this dichotomy play out not just in hormones, but in actual brain metabolism.
Yeah.
Particularly when we look at early life stress, or ELS.
Brain metabolism.
Yeah. The sources reference recent studies using animal models, specifically rodents, that show striking sex differences when exposed to threat after experiencing early life stress.
Okay.
And what's interesting is that for decades, scientists completely missed this.
Wait, really? How do you miss a fundamental metabolic difference?
Because for a very long time, behavioral neuroscience relied almost exclusively on male rodents.
You're kidding.
I'm not. Researchers believed that the female hormone cycle estrus was, quote, too complicated and would mess up their data.
Oh my gosh.
So they just studied males and assumed females would act the exact same way.
That is staggering. They just ignored half the population because it was inconvenient for the data set.
Exactly.
Yep.
But when researchers finally started including female models and observing how they reacted to threat after experiencing early life stress, they discovered what they call the darting versus freezing behavior.
Darting versus freezing.
Right. When these female animal models are threatened, they tend to exhibit active fear coping strategies. They dart or try to rapidly escape. It's a highly active, visible, frantic response.
And the males?
Males, on the other hand, favor passive coping. When threatened, they freeze. They retreat inward and stay perfectly still.
And the sources emphasize that this isn't just a behavioral choice the rat is making, right? You're saying it's a metabolic reality.
It is deeply metabolic. These behaviors are underpinned by sex-specific alterations in how the brain produces energy and how neurons communicate. After early life stress, females show heightened stress hormone levels immediately after exposure to a new threat.
Yeah.
Their physiological reactivity is acute.
Okay.
They're burning energy instantly to sound the alarm and seek safety. This correlates perfectly with that expressively liable phenotype in human women we talked about. The emotional response is front-loaded. It happens right now, and you can see it.
But in males, the metabolic reprogramming from early life stress creates a delayed or longer-lasting change in brain metabolism.
Exactly.
The energy isn't burned in an immediate visible burst. It supports a passive or internalizing fear strategy. It aligns with the hide and retreat hypothesis. The man might look completely calm or detached on the outside, like he's freezing, but metabolically his brain is locking down.
And the sources even trace some of this metabolic difference down to mitochondrial DNA.
Okay, biology class throwback.
Right. Mitochondria are the powerhouses of our cells, responsible for generating the energy our brains use to function. And crucially, mitochondria are inherited matrilineally, meaning you only get them from your mother.
Wait, I need you to explain this because the sources mention epigenetic priming here, and that sounds like a sci-fi term.
It does sound like sci-fi.
Yeah. What does that actually mean for a real human being?
Think of your DNA as a massive soundboard in a recording studio.
Okay.
The genes are all the different sliders and buttons. Epigenetics is the process of an invisible hand moving those sliders up or downturning certain genes on or dimming them.
Got it.
Your experiences and your environment can move those sliders. The research suggests that a mother's history of severe stress can epigenetically prime her offspring.
Wow.
It alters how those matrilineally inherited mitochondrial pathways handle stress, further embedding these sex-specific responses deep into our biology before the child is even born.
Okay, so we have established the evolutionary blueprint, the startup budget of energy. We have mapped out the neurochemical hardware, the cortisol divide, the oxytocin paradox, and the mitochondrial soundboard. We have these biological baseline thresholds for stress. But the sources are clear. Biology loads the gun, but it's the environment that pulls the trigger.
That's the perfect way to phrase it.
A biological predisposition is just that, a predisposition. It requires an environment to activate it. So how does an unstable upbringing actually install these divergent programs in men and women? We need to look at the scars of upbringing, specifically childhood trauma and attachment.
This is where the theoretical biology meets the deeply personal reality of human development.
Yeah.
The hypothesis that an unstable upbringing produces these gendered outcomes is strongly supported by massive data sets on childhood trauma and adversity, or CTA.
And the statistics are, frankly, they're sobering.
They really are. Meta-analyses indicate that 59.3% of individuals presenting with psychiatric symptoms report a history of childhood trauma.
Let's just pause there for a second. Nearly 60%.
Yes.
That is 6 out of 10 people walking into a clinic with a psychiatric issue carrying a developmental wound from childhood. It's staggering.
It's a huge portion of the population.
And the sources point out that females are more likely to report such experiences than males, though we'll get into why men might underreport later. But what I found most striking in this section of the research is how the type of trauma impacts the genders differently.
It is a crucial distinction that often gets overlooked. The nature of the consequence of childhood trauma varies significantly by gender.
How so?
The data shows that women are more profoundly affected by childhood emotional trauma and sexual abuse. Men, conversely, are more significantly impacted by childhood emotional and physical neglect.
Let's break those profiles down mechanically, starting with the female profile.
Sure.
If a young girl experiences emotional or sexual abuse, how does that morph into expressive liability in adulthood?
It manifests as an internalizing and expressive profile. Exposure to these types of abuse significantly increases the risk of depressive symptoms, severe anxiety, and non-suicidal self-injury, or NSSI. What is particularly interesting is the social manifestation of this trauma. Women with a history of CTA are actually more likely to be married or in de facto relationships compared to men with similar trauma histories.
Which seems totally counterintuitive at first glance.
It does.
If you've suffered severe interpersonal trauma, you would think that person would avoid relationships entirely to protect themselves.
You would think so, but it points to a desperate biological drive toward seeking stability despite underlying agonizing insecurity.
Wow.
They're using that ancestral tend-and-befriend hardware, but because of the trauma, it is basically misfiring. They're desperately seeking affiliation to soothe the trauma, which makes them highly, painfully sensitive to any shift in that relationship.
And the mechanism driving this, the actual psychological engine keeping this anxiety alive, is rumination. The sources identify rumination as the critical mediator here.
Yes, the rumination loop. Rumination is the process of repetitively, almost obsessively, thinking about the causes, consequences, and symptoms of one's distress.
It's awful.
Longitudinal evidence shows that rumination is the central pathway between childhood trauma and behaviors like self-injury in females.
I really want to visualize how that rumination loop works because it acts almost like a magnifying glass.
Right.
A young girl experiences emotional abuse. She internalizes that experience into a cycle of self-criticism. Her internal monologue becomes, I am bad, people will always leave me. I have to be hyper-vigilant to make sure I don't get rejected again. It creates these constant anxious expectations of rejection. So as an adult, every ambiguous text message, every slightly off-tone comment from a partner, gets fed into this rumination loop.
Exactly.
The magnifying glass takes a tiny spark of ambiguity and focuses it into a burning hole of distress. It makes her rejection sensitivity expressly liable because her own internal mental processes are constantly reinforcing the threat.
It is a profoundly painful and exhausting way to live. The threat is never really gone because the mind is constantly generating it.
Right.
Now, contrast that with the male profile. Remember, men are statistically more deeply impacted by neglect, the absence of care, the lack of emotional mirroring, the silence.
Right. And their biological hardware leans toward freeze or retreat. So how does a childhood of neglect shape the adult male?
It leads to an externalizing and withdrawal profile. Childhood neglect in men is strongly linked to adult anhedonia.
Let's define anhedonia for the listeners. That's the inability to feel pleasure or joy.
Correct. It is a severe emotional flattening. It isn't just sadness. It is a void where positive emotion should be.
Wow.
It's also linked to cardiovascular issues and a less overt symptomatic presentation. A man's response to neglect often involves a complete deactivation of the attachment system.
The deactivation.
This is a hide-and-retreat behavior in its purest form. If no one was there to answer his cries when he was an infant or a young boy, his developing brain eventually learns a brutal lesson. Crying, or expressing any emotional need, is a waste of bioenergetic resources and a massive vulnerability.
So the brain simply shuts the system down.
Exactly. He becomes emotionally numb rather than expressive.
I really want to luxuriate in an analogy here to help visualize this, because attachment theory is essentially the psychological proof of everything we've been discussing.
It really is.
We can think of attachment styles like the smartphone operating systems installed in our brains during childhood. You've got two main dysfunctional OS types, anxious and avoidant.
And meta-analyses consistently reveal a stark gender divide in these operating systems. Women exhibit significantly higher levels of attachment-related anxiety, while men exhibit higher levels of attachment-related avoidance.
Right. So anxious attachment, the female-dominated style, is an OS that is constantly pushing urgent, flashing notifications.
Yes.
It's scanning the environment 24/7 for threats of abandonment. It overreacts to ambiguous social cues. He didn't use an exclamation point, he hates me. She took 3 hours to text back, I'm being phased out.
It's overwhelming.
It is exhausting, but it is highly visible. And because the distress is so loud and acute, these individuals are much more likely to seek help.
Which perfectly explains the clinical data showing that attachment anxiety is positively associated with psychotherapy use.
Oh, that makes sense.
Women are far more likely to sit in a therapist's office to try and find a way to turn down the volume of those relentless push notifications.
But then you look at avoidant attachment, the male-dominated style. This is an OS stuck on airplane mode.
Airplane mode, yeah.
It involves a negative view of others and a total denial of the importance of relationships. The man doesn't get the push notifications because he has shut off the receiver entirely.
Yeah, it has.
He deactivates his emotional needs to protect against the battery drain of perceived inevitable rejection.
And because the system is on airplane mode, he doesn't feel the immediate acute distress of anxiety in the same way. He feels numb. He feels intensely self-reliant.
Right.
Therefore, he doesn't think he needs to fix anything. This perfectly explains the data showing that men use psychotherapy about 30% less than women. They don't see their emotional retreat as a symptom of trauma. They see it as a highly successful survival strategy.
If you are dating someone on airplane mode, it is infuriating.
Oh, sure.
You try to call them, you try to connect, and it just goes straight to voicemail. You think they are ignoring you on purpose, but you have to realize their receiver is literally powered down. It's a defensive mechanism to avoid the pain of rejection.
It is a fortress. And it's important to note for our listeners that about 65% of the general population manages to develop a secure attachment style, which features effective emotional regulation and buffers against this extreme adult rejection sensitivity.
Okay, that's good to know.
But for those with unstable upbringings, the divergence into anxious or avoidant is profound and lasting.
Okay, so we've covered the biological hardware and the trauma-installed software. But if trauma writes the code, society provides the user manual.
Absolutely.
We don't grow up in vacuums. We grow up in cultures that actively shape, police, and reward these behaviors. How does a purely biological urge get turned into a rigid cultural rule? This brings us to the cultural reinforcement of rejection sensitivity.
It happens incredibly early, and it happens relentlessly. Cultural forces play a paramount role in pouring concrete over these biological tendencies, reinforcing the expressive liability in women and the retreat in men. From a very young age, gender socialization dictates the display rules for emotion. And for boys, the primary lesson is the construction of male stoicism.
The classic man-up mentality, don't cry, don't show weakness.
Precisely. Societal norms pressure males to be hyper-independent and strong, while often perceiving females as inherently vulnerable. But this modern male stoicism, the tendency to appear completely unaffected by challenges and to suppress emotion, is not a biological lack of feeling.
Right.
The cortisol data and the brain metabolism data we discussed earlier prove they do feel the stress, acutely. The stoicism we see is a cultural performance. It is a mask.
And the sources point out that by early adolescence, boys who show vulnerability, who let that mask slip even a little bit, are ruthlessly policed by their peers.
Brutally.
They're bullied, teased, or completely ostracized from the group. So they're essentially forced to weld the mask of detachment to their faces to avoid social rejection.
And welding that mask on has profound, lasting implications for their development. First, it stunts their emotional vocabulary.
Stunts it how?
Studies show that boys often score significantly lower on tests, measuring the vocabulary to describe internal emotional states. Think about it. If you are never allowed to express a feeling, you never learn the words for it.
Oh, wow.
You don't know the difference between feeling disappointed, betrayed, or lonely. Consequently, this severely limits their ability to process rejection healthily.
Right.
When they feel the sting of exclusion, they can't say, I feel hurt and abandoned right now. Instead, they express that distress through externalizing behaviors. It comes out as anger, irritability, or complete withdrawal.
And this leads to a phenomenon the sources call the interviewer effect, which I found incredibly revealing. It proves that men know they're wearing a mask.
It really does.
The data shows that in research settings, men will disclose more masculine emotions like anger or pride to other male interviewers. But if they're going to reveal vulnerable emotions like sadness or fear, they are far more likely to do so to female interviewers.
Yes, because they perceive women as more empathetic and, crucially, less likely to punish them for the vulnerability.
Wow, so sad.
This interviewer effect confirms that men hide their rejection sensitivity primarily in social hierarchies, where they feel they must maintain a facade of strength, usually around other men.
So how are we teaching kids these display rules in the first place? I mean, a baby isn't born knowing what emotions are acceptable. The research brings up gender schema theory.
Gender schema theory suggests that children observe the world and internalize schemas or blueprints for their own sex.
Right.
They learn early on that boys are tough and girls are nurturing, and then they unconsciously select environments and behaviors that reinforce these beliefs.
But the parents are the ones really enforcing the schema, right? The data on fathers reacting to toddlers is particularly eye-opening here.
It is. Fathers, more than mothers, tend to provide greater contingent responses, meaning they pay attention and react supportively to sadness and anxiety in their daughters.
Okay.
The little girl falls and cries, and the father rushes over. Oh, sweetheart, it's okay to cry. Let me comfort you. But those same fathers often ignore their son's tears. However, they will reward and engage with expressions of anger and disharmonious emotions in their boys.
They might ignore the boy crying over a scraped knee, but if the boy gets frustrated and throws a toy or acts aggressively, the father engages. Hey, tough guy, calm down.
Yes.
This differential reinforcement is literally a training program. We are training girls to express their vulnerability, solidifying that expressive liability, while simultaneously training boys to convert their vulnerability into aggression or silence, solidifying the retreat.
And this training program isn't just a modern localized invention. The sources dive deep into the historical, religious, and philosophical roots that have institutionalized these behaviors for centuries. It's fascinating how philosophical concepts get warped to fit these biological biases.
I really want to spend some time on Stoicism here because the internet has completely warped this philosophy over the last few years.
It has been profoundly misunderstood.
Yeah.
Historically, Stoicism originated in ancient Greece and Rome as a profound, nuanced philosophy of virtue, ethics, and self-control. Adherents like Seneca and Epictetus believed that reason was the primary factor in happiness. Crucially, they believed that there is no sex in souls.
Wow.
They did not view virtue, reason, or emotional regulation as inherently male or female traits.
Which is an amazing historical fact because early feminist thinkers actually utilized Stoic principles to argue for women's equality.
Exactly.
Writers like Mary Wollstonecraft used Stoicism to say, look, Women have the exact same capacity for reason and virtue as men. We aren't just biologically destined to be overly emotional.
Exactly. They used it as an equalizing force. But what we see today is something the sources refer to as broicism.
Broicism, I love that.
It is a highly commercialized, hyper-gendered version of the philosophy propagated by podcasts and internet culture that completely misses the point. Modern broicism frequently conflates true stoic resilience with emotional suppression.
Hmm.
It reinforces the toxic idea that strength for men requires being emotionally unaffected, particularly by social rejection or loss.
It provides young men with pseudo-philosophical armor. It gives them an intellectual excuse to stay on airplane mode. They think they're being like the great Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, but really they're just engaging in moral disengagement and self-isolation to avoid dealing with their trauma.
And if we put the lens back even further, we have to look at how overarching institutions formalize these roles on a societal level. The sources impartially analyze the impact of religious paradigms, particularly within the Abrahamic traditions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam.
Right.
These religions have historically institutionalized gender roles through their foundational texts and leadership structures.
The text points to the creation myth of Eve being created from Adam's rib. Historically, regardless of one's personal faith, that text had been utilized to defend patriarchal hierarchies, where men are positioned as the heads and protectors, while women are considered spiritual equals, but are expected to be submissive in social and familial roles.
And this leads to what sociologists call benevolent sexism theory.
Benevolent sexism.
Religion often propagates a benevolent view of women, characterizing them as morally pure, self-sacrificing, but inherently needing male protection. This ideology actively rewards women who adhere to traditional nurturing roles, which perfectly aligns with and encourages their biological expressive liability.
Right.
And conversely, it punishes women who exhibit masculine independence or stoicism.
It also dictates how men and women are allowed to seek support when they're stressed. The sources highlight something called religious commitment gaps. Worldwide, women generally report higher levels of daily prayer and attendance at religious services, especially in Christian-majority countries.
Yes. Religion often provides an expressive, communal social support network for women, further reinforcing their orientation toward seeking social relief when stressed.
Mm-hmm.
They can gather, share burdens, and pray together, a formalized tend-and-befriend environment. However, the data notes that men attend services more frequently in Muslim and Orthodox Jewish societies, where communal religious participation is explicitly framed as a mandatory masculine duty and norm. So again, culture dictates the avenue for processing existential stress.
Okay, so culture and religion provide these massive overarching structures that shape us over a lifetime. But the most immediate pressing structure a child faces on a daily basis is the family's financial reality.
Absolutely.
You cannot talk about childhood trauma and unstable environments without talking about money. If the parents are broke, I get that they are stressed. But how does an unpaid electric bill literally rewire a 9-year-old's social confidence? This leads us to the family stress model.
The family stress model, or FSM, is a critical lens because economic hardship acts as a proximal stressor.
Proximal meaning immediate.
Yes. It is a direct, immediate pressure that exacerbates all the biological and psychological vulnerabilities we've discussed. The FSM describes a very specific, tragic cascade of how objective material hardship ripples through the family dynamic.
Let's track that cascade. Step 1, the material hardship.
Step 1 is the objective reality of poverty, unpaid bills, food insecurity, housing instability, the car breaking down. This objective reality creates intense parental emotional distress. Mothers who experience greater financial strain are significantly more likely to report depressive symptoms and lower quality co-parenting relationships.
Step 2, the parents are stressed, so they start fighting. The environment becomes volatile.
Yes, it leads to severe interparental conflict. And step 3, this parental stress inevitably spills over into their interactions with their children.
Oh, man.
It leads to harsh, punitive, and highly inconsistent parenting. The parents simply do not have the emotional bandwidth or the bioenergetic resources to provide a secure, comforting environment.
They're burning through their own biological venture capital just trying to keep the lights on and put food on the table. They cannot invest in the slow, patient, emotional development of their kids. So what happens to the kid's brain in step 4?
The instability is devastating for social development. The research shows that children from economically stressed households struggle to make friends and feel significantly less confident in social situations by age 9.
Age 9.
Their social competence is measurably reduced. They have been robbed of a routine, predictable environment, which completely undermines their secure base. The child's brain registers the environment as highly dangerous, forcing the deployment of the fast life history strategy we discussed at the very beginning.
Wow.
The girl's brain prepares for expressive hypervigilance. The boy's brain prepares for emotional retreat.
I really want to highlight something profound here. We often think of wealth in purely materialistic terms. Money buys better food, nicer schools, vacations, a bigger house. But according to this research, what wealth actually buys is a predictable emotional environment. High income acts as an environmentally secure base. It buys the neurological luxury of a slow life history strategy.
It absolutely does.
It allows a child's brain to say, the world is safe. I don't need to be hypervigilant. I don't need to shut down my emotions to survive. Wealth is a biological buffer.
That is an excellent insight, and the data supports it by showing how financial stability can actually break the intergenerational transmission of trauma.
Really?
For example, a father's attachment anxiety is usually passed down to his daughter through his parenting style. However, if that father has a high income, that transmission is broken.
Wow.
The financial security buffers the emotional insecurity. The predictable environment overrides the father's anxious cues.
But there is a really beautiful anomaly in the data regarding fathers and poverty that the sources highlight, the paternal compensation anomaly. Even in the face of all this grim data, there's a glimmer of resilience.
Yes, it is a fascinating nuance. While severe economic pressure generally leads to harsher parenting, some studies show that fathers facing poverty may actually offer more emotional support to their children as a compensatory mechanism.
That's incredible.
When they realize they cannot provide material security, they intuitively try to over-provide emotional security. When this happens, it can successfully act as a buffer against the child developing severe rejection sensitivity.
That's a testament to human agency. Even in the face of crushing structural hardship, a parent can consciously choose to change the emotional weather in the home.
Yes.
But if that buffering doesn't happen, the financial stress cements those gendered coping mechanisms for life. The sources mention a study on university students dealing with financial stress that proves this carries right into adulthood.
Right. When young adults face financial crises in college, worrying about tuition, student loans, rent, they mirror the exact mechanisms we've been discussing.
Yes.
Female students under financial stress tend to use emotion-focused coping. They become expressive, they seek out peers to vent, they worry visibly, they ruminate.
And the men...
Male students, on the other hand, often show a decrease in reported stress over time. But they aren't actually less stressed, they are employing adaptive coping, which in this context means distancing themselves from the problem, internalizing the stress, and retreating emotionally into video games or substance use.
Okay, let's take a breath and look at the whole picture. We have seen that evolutionary biology loads the gun with these different reproductive survival strategies. Then, childhood trauma and attachment instability aim the gun. Society and cultural socialization pull the trigger by telling boys to man up and girls to ruminate, and the economy acts as the pressure cooker that dictates how often that trigger gets pulled.
That's a great summary.
So what happens when all of these factors go off at once? What does this look like in the real world, in hospitals and in therapists' offices?
When these divergent responses to an unstable upbringing culminate in adulthood, we see two very distinct, highly gendered psychiatric profiles. The expressive liability of women and the retreat of men map almost perfectly onto the clinical concepts of internalizing versus externalizing disorders.
Let's explore the internalizing spectrum for women first. Instead of just listing off disorders, I want to understand how this hypersensitivity to rejection practically shapes a diagnosis like PTSD or borderline personality disorder.
Women show significantly higher rates of internalizing disorders, clinical depression, generalized anxiety, and eating disorders. These conditions all involve a massive buildup of internal negative emotions, sadness, guilt, fear.
Right.
The sources specifically highlight a disparity in PTSD. Women are twice as likely as men to develop post-traumatic stress disorder, and the context matters immensely. Women are more likely to experience interpersonal trauma, like sexual assault, domestic violence, or severe emotional abuse at a younger age.
So the trauma isn't just an accident or a natural disaster. It's a profound social rejection and physical violation by another human being.
Exactly. This leads to profound symptoms of being easily startled, feeling emotionally numb at times, but constantly avoiding reminders of the trauma. The social rejection is tied directly to a physical threat to their survival. The tend-and-befriend system is completely shattered.
And the sources also point to borderline personality disorder, or BPD, being highly prevalent in women in clinical settings, which makes total sense based on everything we've learned, because the core features of BPD are unstable relationships, a frantic, desperate fear of abandonment, and massive emotional dysregulation.
Yes.
It is the absolute extreme endpoint of expressive liability in the anxious attachment smartphone OS. It is pathological rejection sensitivity.
That is an accurate characterization. Now let's pivot to the men. Men dominate the externalizing spectrum.
Meaning they don't turn the pain inward on themselves with sadness and rumination. They project the pain outward onto the environment.
Exactly. Men show much higher rates of antisocial personality disorder, conduct disorder, substance abuse, and ADHD. The retreat mechanism drives them to numb the pain. And I really want to focus on substance abuse here because it perfectly illustrates the biological goal.
Right. How does alcohol or drug abuse mechanically serve this hide and retreat strategy?
Alcohol is a central nervous system depressant. When a man whose biology is screaming at him to suppress vulnerability feels the agonizing sting of social rejection, he doesn't have the emotional vocabulary to process it, and his culture forbids him from crying. Alcohol biochemically achieves the numbing his brain is desperately trying to reach. It artificially forces the system into airplane mode. He isn't just partying, he is self-medicating a hyperactive threat response.
That reframes addiction so profoundly, and this leads to something the sources call masked depression. I think this is one of the most critical concepts in the entire research synthesis. What is masked depression?
Masked depression is a tragic reality in male mental health. Because the medical and psychiatric fields have traditionally defined depression by its female typical presentation, overt sadness, crying, expressing worthlessness, lethargy male depression often goes completely unrecognized by doctors and even by the men themselves.
Because the man isn't sitting on the couch crying. He doesn't look like the classic depression commercial.
Right. He is externalizing. His depression manifests as sudden irritability, massive risk-taking behavior, suddenly working 80 hours a week to avoid going home, getting into physical fights, or dramatically increasing his alcohol intake.
Wow.
These are male-specific symptoms of depression. He is retreating from the pain of rejection by numbing himself with substances or distracting himself with aggression, and because doctors and loved ones don't recognize this as depression, he doesn't get the help he desperately needs.
And the consequences of that misdiagnosis are fatal. The suicide statistics in the sources are devastating.
Men exhibit up to a 4-fold increase in suicide rates compared to women. And the trigger for this is deeply tied to the specific types of rejection we've been discussing. Men are particularly vulnerable to suicide when facing economic or social losses. Losing a job, going through a divorce, facing a public humiliation, or a massive financial failure.
For a man whose entire biological and cultural hardware is built on maintaining status and resource acquisition, an economic or social loss represents the ultimate form of social rejection.
Yes.
It is a total failure of his evolutionary survival strategy. And with his attachment system on airplane mode, he has no way to ask for help. He can't reach out to the tribe.
He is completely isolated, and this brings us to a concept that should change how we all interact with the men in our lives. Angry rejection sensitivity.
What's that?
We know anxious rejection sensitivity leads someone to frantically search for comfort and reassurance. But angry rejection sensitivity predicts highly aggressive, hostile responses to sexual or social rejection.
Understanding anger as a panicked retreat from the pain of rejection completely changes how we might view an aggressive or highly defensive person.
It really does.
If you're listening and thinking about the last time you saw a guy blow up over a minor slight or act incredibly defensive when criticized, they aren't just being a jerk. Their biological alarm system is misfiring. It's telling them their survival and status are threatened, so they're lashing out to create distance and protect themselves. Anger is often just the bodyguard for immense sadness.
It is a vital reframe. And we see these dynamics play out globally. The sources do a cross-cultural comparison to ensure we aren't just looking at Western-educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic or weird societies. We have to make sure this isn't just an American or European phenomenon.
Right, because in the West, we often equate emotional expression with authenticity. We think crying is the only true way to process emotion. But that's not a universal human truth.
No, it isn't. In collectivist cultures, such as parts of East Asia or India, Emotional regulation and suppression are often prioritized over individual expression in order to maintain group cohesion and social harmony. However, even within those different cultural values, the underlying gendered dimorphism persists. The Indian context in the sources notes that men are still heavily socialized toward emotional stoicism and authority, while women are allowed more flexibility to express compassion and empathy, aligning with caregiving roles.
The cultural paint job might look different, but the underlying engine operates the exact same way. The sources also point to global patterns of play as the root of these biases. Anywhere in the world, across almost all cultures, children naturally tend to segregate by gender, with girls engaging in cooperative, relationship-focused play, and boys engaging in competitive, hierarchy-focused play.
Which perfectly mirrors the ancestral survival strategies we discussed in segment 1. But there is one final, crucial piece of evidence in the sources that proves social rejection operates on these biological pathways regardless of biological sex, and that is the data on gender incongruence.
Yes, the research into gender-diverse and transgender populations, this is incredibly compelling because it separates the biological sex from the social experience of rejection.
The research shows that family rejection due to gender identity is linked to massive, tragic increases in suicidality, homelessness, and substance use. When a gender-diverse individual experiences systematic distal stress processes, such as societal transphobia, harassment, structural discrimination, and exclusion, it triggers the exact same internal mechanisms we've been analyzing all hour.
The sources say it leads to proximal processes like intense shame, concealment, and internalized transphobia. So, targeted social rejection universally causes trauma. It triggers both the retreat of concealment and the liability of deep shame in these individuals. It proves that the agonizing pain of social exclusion is a universal human reality. We all break under the weight of it, even as the specific manifestations might follow gender-socialized lines.
It synthesizes everything beautifully. The gathered evidence across biology, psychology, and sociology overwhelmingly proves the central hypothesis.
Let's summarize it.
For women, the expressive liability is proven by their higher cortisol surges to social threats, the cognitive mediation of rumination, their overrepresentation in anxious attachment, and the socialization that actively rewards their vulnerability.
And for men, the hide-and-retreat hypothesis is proven by the hormonal deactivation via vasopressin, their overrepresentation in avoidant attachment, the cultural enforcement of the stoic mask, and their propensity to retreat into externalizing behaviors like substance abuse to artificially distance themselves from the pain.
Ultimately, the most important takeaway from this entire stack of sources is this. While the biological and evolutionary foundations of these gendered responses are incredibly robust, the wiring of gender is soft, not hard.
Meaning, we aren't doomed by our biology. The script isn't finalized.
Exactly. Social constructs, trauma-informed parenting, and economic stability have the immense power to mitigate these deep-seated responses.
That's a huge relief.
For the future of mental health, men must actively reclaim vulnerability. Breaking the mask of toxic stoicism is not just healthy. It is an act of moral resistance necessary for authentic living. And for women, clinical interventions must fiercely focus on disrupting those rumination pathways that turn early trauma into a lifetime of agonizing anxiety. We have to address the psychological and the socioeconomic impacts together, so neither gender is forced to choose between the exhaustion of expressive liability and the profound isolation of emotional retreat.
That is a deeply powerful synthesis, and it leaves me with one final provocative thought that I want to leave you, the listener, to mull over as you go about the rest of your day. We have spent this entire deep dive looking at how our evolutionary hardware developed these fast life strategies and rejection sensitivities for a world of small, physical, tribal interactions. You knew everyone in your 150-person tribe, rejection was rare, but it was physical and immediate. But what happens now? How do these deeply gendered biological responses, the male urge to retreat and the female urge to ruminate, adapt to a digital world? Because today, social rejection isn't just getting kicked out of a physical tribe. It is administered constantly, invisibly, and on a massive scale by algorithms.
Wow.
When you swipe on a dating app and get no matches, when your post gets no likes, you are experiencing micro-rejections curated by code rather than actual human beings. If our biological hardware breaks down under the stress of local tribal rejection, how on earth is it going to survive algorithmic rejection?
That is the defining psychological question of our current era. The hardware simply wasn't built for the digital scale. We are running a million-year-old operating system on a 21st century network.
It really is staggering to think about. And that brings us to the end of our journey today. I want to sincerely thank you for joining us on this intellectual deep dive. If you enjoyed peeling back the layers of human behavior with us, please subscribe to the show and share this specific Today in the Hypothesis with that friend who loves dissecting psychology as much as we do. Because at the end of the day, psychological pain might not be as clean and easy to see as a broken arm on an x-ray. It might be a hidden internal bleed. But by understanding the evolutionary and biological mechanisms behind it, we finally have a way to start applying the right kind of cast. We'll see you next time.